Welcome to the Restricted Handling Podcast. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. Russia is leaning hard into its winter warfare playbook, and the center of gravity is energy. Ukrainian intelligence and President Volodymyr Zelensky are warning that Moscow is preparing long-range strikes against electricity substations that power Ukraine's nuclear plants. That's not just another infrastructure hit. That's flirting with a line that makes even seasoned nuclear safety officials nervous. Ukraine needs about 18 gigawatts to get through the winter. Right now, it can only generate around 11. Knock nuclear plants off the grid, even temporarily, and you're talking about large parts of the country going dark and cold at the worst possible moment. And this isn't hypothetical. International nuclear monitors are already confirming damage to substations tied to nuclear operations, including at Chernobyl. Over the last week alone, air raid alarms or military activity have been reported at every single nuclear site in Ukraine. That's 5 for 5. This is Russia using the grid as a pressure point, not because it helps them win ground tomorrow, but because it hurts civilians today. Old school coercion, updated with drones and winter weather. Speaking of drones, the volume here matters. Overnight, Russia launched more than 200 drones, over half of them Shahed variants, hitting targets across Ukraine, including Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and Odessa. Ukrainian officials say 30 drones made it through and struck 15 locations, many of them tied to energy infrastructure. The energy minister in Kiev says Russia has now struck every power plant in the country at least once since the full-scale invasion began, with more than 600 attacks total. Kiev is operating at about half the electricity it needs, and the mayor of the capital is openly telling residents to consider leaving the city if they can. That's not wartime bravado. That's crisis management. Ukraine is hitting back, and not symbolically. Ukrainian drones struck substations in Russian-occupied Zaporizhia and Kherson, knocking out power to more than 200,000 households in freezing temperatures. Nearly 400 settlements lost electricity. Ukrainian strikes also hit a major substation in occupied Melitopol, triggering widespread outages. This back-and-forth energy warfare is now symmetrical in intent, if not in scale. Both sides know the grid hurts more than armor. While this is happening, the diplomatic soundtrack could not be more surreal. On one hand, US, Ukrainian, and European officials are gearing up for another round of talks in Davos. On the other, the Kremlin is openly preparing its domestic audience for no deal. A Kremlin-linked former Ukrainian politician went on state media and flat out said there will be no peace this year, arguing that time is on Russia's side and negotiations are pointless unless Ukraine gives in completely. This is classic Kremlin messaging discipline. Putin doesn't have to say it himself. Someone louder and more extreme says it for him, and the message lands. Russia is still showing up to the meetings, though. Putin's investment envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, is heading to Davos to meet members of the U.S. delegation. He's already met recently with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, and he briefed Putin afterward. So Moscow is talking, shaking hands, posing for the cameras, but at the same time escalating strikes and publicly dismissing peace. If this feels like watching someone negotiate while actively flipping the table, that's because it is. The reconstruction angle is now fully part of the war narrative. The Trump administration is putting BlackRock at the center of Ukraine's post-war recovery planning, with talk of an $800 billion prosperity plan. Ukrainian officials are selling it as a Marshall Plan moment. European officials are less enthusiastic. BlackRock already tried and failed to raise even a fraction of that money earlier in the war, and European capitals are deeply uneasy about public European funds flowing into a U.S.-managed private structure. The fear is that reconstruction becomes less about rebuilding Ukraine and more about carving up investment opportunities. Kiev understands this dynamic and appears to be tailoring its messaging to a business-first White House, whether it likes it or not. On the ground, Ukraine is doing everything it can to make sure Russia doesn't walk into negotiations holding a shiny new trophy. Kupiansk is the clearest example. Russia keeps claiming it controls the city. Ukraine keeps proving otherwise. Ukrainian drone units are hunting Russian soldiers trying to infiltrate the city through gas pipelines, inflatable rafts, forest paths. This is less Red Army steamroller and more desperate whack-a-mole. Ukrainian forces recently raised their flag over the city administration building, and Zelensky himself showed up on video from the outskirts to drive the point home. Kupiansk matters because it's a logistics hub. Losing it would have handed Moscow a bargaining chip just as talks intensify. Instead, Ukraine has turned it into a case study in how drones, intelligence, and persistence can blunt Russian manpower advantages. Russian troops are still trying, but they're doing it with small assault teams, motorcycles, even horses in some areas, and minimal heavy armor. It's gritty, it's slow, and it's expensive for them. The drone war is accelerating in a way that should worry anyone tracking industrial capacity. Ukraine's top commander says Russia is currently producing around 400 Shahed-type drones per day and plans to ramp that up to 1,000 per day. That's not about precision, that's about saturation. Ukraine's response has been deep strikes and adaptation. Ukrainian forces say they hit more than 700 targets inside Russia last year, causing billions in damage, much of it to energy and oil infrastructure. Ukrainian commanders are also pushing interceptor drones as a cheaper, faster way to counter mass drone attacks instead of burning through missile stocks. Zooming out, Russia's global position looks shakier than the Kremlin would like to admit. Allies like Venezuela, Syria, and Iran are under pressure or outright attack, and Moscow's ability to back them up is limited. Russian ultranationalists are increasingly vocal about frustration, arguing that restraint is making Russia look weak. Recent incidents, including the U.S. seizure of a Russian-linked oil tanker and Russia's awkward handling of a downed Azerbaijani passenger jet, have not helped the image. At the same time, Moscow is enjoying the chaos when it can. Russian officials are openly cheering tensions between Washington and NATO allies over Greenland, framing it as evidence that the transatlantic alliance is cracking. It's not subtle, and it's very on-brand. Add to that the bizarre moment where Putin is invited to join a U.S.-led Board of Peace focused on Gaza while he's still prosecuting a full-scale war in Europe, and you get a sense of how upside down the diplomatic landscape feels right now. Finally, the hybrid war piece continues ticking along in the background. European security services are arresting individuals tied to Russian-linked espionage and sabotage networks, including efforts to infiltrate drone manufacturing companies. Authorities are also fighting over custody of a Russian operative suspected of coordinating incendiary parcel attacks on European air cargo hubs. Moscow wants him back. Europe wants him in court. That tug of war says a lot about how seriously both sides view exposure versus accountability. Thanks so much for listening and for being part of the RH community. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribing, leaving a quick 5-star review, or sharing it with someone you know makes a huge difference. It's how this network will grow.